I was at a dinner party recently, sitting across from a guy who seemed to have modern life completely figured out. He spent the first 20 minutes beaming about his brand new electric vehicle. He was practically vibrating with virtue, describing it not just as a car, but as a moral statement. He looked around the table with this benevolent pity for anyone still driving a gas engine, implying they were essentially burning the planet for fun. To him, that silent engine was absolute proof of his environmental sainthood. But then the conversation took an awkward turn. I asked him, genuinely curious, about the power grid in his neighborhood, which everyone knows is heavily reliant on an aging coal plant down the river. I also mentioned the complex supply chain regarding lithium mining. You would expect a logical rebuttal, right? Instead, the light completely left his eyes. He waved his hand dismissively, almost annoyed, and said, "You're overthinking it. The point is, I'm driving the future." That moment hit me hard. Here was a man ignoring the dirty supply chain and the coal smoke purely because he had purchased the correct symbol of the crowd. Meanwhile, I sat there feeling awkward, almost ashamed, like I was the slow one for bringing up the uncomfortable reality. It made me realize something profound about that nagging feeling of being stupid. We often feel unintelligent not because we lack logic, but because we are the only ones refusing to be sedated by the illusion of consensus. And that experience, that feeling, really crystallized the question that I think we need to unpack today.
Why is it so incredibly difficult to question what society decides is the correct symbol, the universally accepted truth?
Yeah.
We all know, logically, that most big issues, like green technology, for instance, they're incredibly complex. They have these huge, messy supply chains and geopolitical dependencies.
Oh, of course.
And yet the pressure to just conform to the simple positive story is just so intense. So what we're really asking is, what are the actual mechanisms, the psychological, the cultural, even the political ones, that enforce this illusion of consensus?
And that is the mission for this deep dive. We are going to unpack the very fabric of social pressure from the ground up.
Okay, so where do we start?
We have to start with the foundational psychological stuff. The mechanisms that make us literally abandon what our own eyes are telling us just to agree with a group.
Whether the group is right or wrong.
Whether the group is right or wrong. And this helps us understand why someone, like the EV driver in your story, might genuinely prioritize the signal he's sending over the actual substance of the issue, the symbol over the reality.
Precisely. Then we can move from there into how this pressure, this need for compliance, starts to govern our really personal choices.
Okay.
We'll look at how culture moralizes things like food and body image. It transforms these private decisions into public judgments that carry this huge social risk of objection, of being cast out.
Which is a terrifying prospect for most people.
It's the ultimate social threat. And then finally, we have to look at the most powerful enforcer of all, the state, how the state co-opts this pressure by medicalizing political control.
What do you mean by medicalizing?
Basically turning individual compliance, doing what you're told for your own health, into this engine of conformity that spans the entire society. So it's a progression. We go from the individual mind to cultural norms and finally to state power.
Okay, let's do it. Let's start with those building blocks, the psychology of it all. When we talk about conformity, what are we really defining it as?
At its core, conformity is just the act of matching our attitudes, our beliefs, and even our behaviors to what a group considers normal, or, to the prevailing political mood.
And these norms, they aren't like laws written down somewhere.
No, not at all. They're usually implicit. They're the unspoken, specific rules a group shares about how people should behave.
And the driver behind it all is, what? Just a desire to fit in.
Well, it's more fundamental than that, really. It's about efficiency and safety. I mean, think about it. It is so much easier, cognitively and socially, to just follow the path that others have already paved.
Consensus.
Right, the consensus, than it is to strike out on your own and forge a new one that might be, dangerous or just plain wrong.
So it's a shortcut. And this happens without us even realizing it sometimes.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It can be incredibly subtle, just an unconscious influence that creates a kind of predisposed state of mind. Or it can be very overt social pressure, like what you felt at that dinner party, that feeling of being weird for pointing out the coal plant.
I'm thinking about the subtle end of that spectrum first. That unconscious mimicry we all do.
The chameleon effect.
Yes, the chameleon effect. That's it. It's that fascinating automatic tendency we have to mimic each other. Someone crosses their arms, you cross your arms.
Gestures, posture, even the way we talk. We adopt their speech style.
And we do it without thinking. It's all to build rapport and sort of signal, hey, I'm one of you. This is a safe interaction.
Exactly. And that natural wiring for mimicry, for blending in, brings us directly to the two main varieties of social influence that explain why we conform, whether we mean to or not. The first one is called informational influence.
Okay, so informational. This sounds like it's driven by a need for accuracy for the right answer.
That's it, exactly. The motive is accuracy. You genuinely believe the group knows more than you do.
So you turn to them for information.
Right. Especially when you're in a new or ambiguous situation. If you're lost in a city and suddenly everyone starts running in one direction, you don't stand there and analyze it.
You run with them. You assume there's a good reason.
You assume they're better informed. And the key outcome here, the really important part, is something called private acceptance or internalization.
Meaning you don't just go along with it, you actually believe it.
You genuinely change your own beliefs. You incorporate that new information into your own personal framework because you're now convinced it's right.
So to go back to my dinner party example, if that EV driver had, say, read a dozen articles from sources he trusts that all said lithium mining is perfectly ethical,
And he genuinely believed it.
then that would be informational influence leading to his private acceptance of that idea.
Exactly. But that brings us to the second and often more powerful type, normative influence.
And this one isn't about being right.
No, this is about being safe. It's conformity driven purely by a desire for social security within a group. It's about fitting in, and it's rooted in this deep primal fear of rejection, of disapproval, of being cast out.
This sounds much more like what was happening at the dinner table.
It very well could be. And this kind of influence, the normative kind, often leads to compliance. You publicly agree, you say what you're supposed to say.
But inside, you don't believe it at all.
Privately, you completely disagree. It's a performance.
That is fascinating. The outcome, the public agreement, it looks identical from the outside, but the internal motive is completely different.
One is a search for truth. The other is a search for security.
And that search for security, normative influence, that feels like the engine behind what we call groupthink, doesn't it?
It is the engine. It's that destructor pattern where a group values harmony and agreement so much that they stop critically evaluating things. It leads to disastrous outcomes in business, in politics, everywhere. It's a forced manufacture of consent.
And the source material points out that one type tends to dominate depending on the situation.
Yes, and this is crucial. If the norm being pushed could be correct, or the situation is genuinely confusing, informational influence tends to dominate. We look to others for clues. But if the norm is obviously absurd, clearly wrong, or has nothing to do with factual truth, then normative influence takes over.
Because the goal isn't accuracy anymore.
The goal shifts entirely to social security. The desire to belong completely overrides the desire to be right.
Okay, to really feel the weight of this, we have to talk about the classic experiments. Where should we start, Sharif?
We have to start with Muzaffer Sharif's work from 1935. Sharif wanted to know just how powerful a group's perception could be when objective reality was. Well, when it was completely unclear.
This is the perfect example of that informational influence at work, right? The experiment with the dot of light.
The autokinetic effect. He put participants in a totally dark room and had them stare at a single small dot of light. Then he asked them to estimate how much it moved.
But the whole trick was the light wasn't moving at all.
Not one bit. The apparent movement is a sensory illusion. It's a trick your eyes play on you in total darkness, and it's completely unique to each person.
So on day one, when they were making estimates alone, what happened?
The estimates were all over the place, wildly different. Someone might say it moved 3 inches, the next person says 10.
But then he put them in groups.
Exactly. Over the next few days, he had them discuss their judgments aloud with each other. And what happened was their personal estimates started to converge.
They started to agree.
They ended up agreeing on a single common frame of reference. They basically created a group average.
They created a social reality because the physical reality was a complete mystery.
That is exactly how social norms develop. When the stimulus is unclear, we look to each other for clues on how to interpret the situation. We build a consensus.
And there's a finding from later research that I think is so relevant for anyone listening. It's about motivation.
Yes, this is fascinating. They found that the participants who were highly motivated to be accurate, maybe they were offered a cash prize for getting it right, they actually conformed more.
More? You'd think they would trust their own eyes more.
But they conformed up to 51% of the time, compared to just 35% in the low motivation group.
Wow. That is so counterintuitive. But it makes sense.
It does when you think about it.
If you really, really care about having the correct answer in a complex situation and you don't trust your own information, you put even more faith in the collective. You assume the group's wisdom will minimize the error.
Exactly. It shows the genuine rational pull of informational conformity when things are confusing. Now, let's contrast that with the other big one, Solomon Asch's experiment in 1951.
Right. Asch wanted to do the opposite. He wanted to make the situation completely unambiguous.
He assumed, logically, that if the answer was perfectly clear, conformity would just plummet.
And this was the famous line judgment task. Participants were shown a standard line and had to match it to one of 3 other lines.
And the correct answer was obvious. I mean, a child could get it right every time.
Yeah.
But the setup was a sham. The real participant was in a room with a bunch of accomplices, actors, who were instructed to give the wrong answer.
They gave the clearly incorrect answer on 12 out of 18 trials.
And the finding is still shocking, even today. It's just this raw demonstration of the power of a wrong majority. Pure normative influence.
Right. What were the numbers?
Despite the correct answer being self-evident, 75% of participants conformed and sided with the clearly incorrect majority at least once.
75%. That's 3 out of 4 people.
And on average, people conformed about a third of the time. They went against their own eyes.
So they weren't looking for the truth in that situation. They were just looking for acceptance.
That's what they said afterwards. When Asch interviewed them, they admitted they knew the group was wrong. They didn't actually agree with the answers.
So why do it?
They just didn't want to look like a maverick. They didn't want to appear odd or risk the quiet judgment of a group of strangers. They complied publicly to avoid that horrible, awkward feeling of dissent.
And this really brings my dinner party story into focus. You have to wonder, was the EV driver acting out of informational influence? A genuine internalized belief that his car was pure?
Or was normative?
Right, or was it just this overwhelming desire to project the correct symbol and avoid being the odd one out, the one questioning the consensus?
And that dismissal, you're overthinking it, that really suggests the latter, doesn't it? The goal wasn't a factual debate. The goal was to shut down dissent and maintain social signaling.
Asch also showed how fragile this kind of conformity can be, though.
Oh, incredibly fragile.
Yeah.
If the participant was allowed to just write down their answer secretly instead of saying it aloud,
The pressure was off.
conformity dropped dramatically. The moment you grant anonymity, the pressure just evaporates.
And what about having an ally?
Even more revealing. If just one of the accomplices broke from the majority and gave the correct answer, the real participants' conformity rate just plummeted.
So a single voice of dissent does more than just dissent for itself.
It shatters the illusion of consensus. It gives silent permission to others to trust their own judgment. It validates the very act of independence.
What about group size? Does it matter if it's 3 people against you or 30?
It does, but only up to a point. Conformity increased a lot, up to about 3 or 4 opponents. It peaked at around 30%.
And after that?
Adding more people to the wrong majority had very little additional impact. The effect just plateaus.
Why is that?
Well, the speculation is that once the majority gets too big, say 7 or 8 people all agreeing on something obviously false, you start to suspect something is fishy.
You suspect collusion.
Yeah, it stops feeling like a genuine social norm and starts feeling like some kind of weird orchestrated event. The pressure loses its authenticity.
So all of this gives us a sort of continuum of response, right? It's not just conform or don't conform.
Donaldson Forsyth laid out this whole spectrum. At one end, you have compliance or acquiescence. That's the Asch experiment.
Public agreement, private disagreement.
Yes, a superficial performance to get approval or avoid getting sanctioned.
And then moving in from there.
You get conversion. This is true conformity or internalization. You publicly and privately agree. You actually change your deep beliefs to match the groups. This is the end goal of real informational influence.
And then, of course, you have the people who just refuse to play the game at all.
That's independence or dissent. You simply stick to your own personal standards, no matter the social cost.
But there's a fourth type that often gets confused with independence.
Right. Anti-conformity or counter-conformity.
The contrarian. The person who disagrees just for the sake of disagreeing.
Exactly. They take the opposite opinion, not because they think it's more accurate, but purely from a need to rebel against the group. Which is ironic
They are
because
still being controlled by the group.
they are just as beholden to the group's agenda as the people who comply. Their actions are still defined, just in reverse. So this whole spectrum really shows that maintaining true intellectual independence, real dissent, is an act of profound psychological strength against these powerful innate social forces that are always pulling us toward the crowd.
This is such a great map for how social pressure works in an abstract sense. But the force just becomes overwhelming when compliance isn't about lines on a card anymore.
Right.
It's about your identity, your worth, your sense of belonging. So we have to shift from conformity in a lab to the cultural mechanisms where if you deviate, you face objection.
And to do that, we pivot to the deep structure of cultural conformity. We can use something that is absolutely universal in modern life, the moralization of the body, especially through diet culture.
It's a perfect case study.
It really is.
Yeah.
The way we relate to food, to eating,
Yeah.
to our own bodies, it has become so profoundly moralized that it operates as this incredibly sophisticated mechanism of social control. It goes so far beyond just aesthetics or health.
It really defines personhood, doesn't it? It defines dignity and worthiness, which are usually symbolized by thinness.
Yeah.
And then it casts any deviation, specifically fatness, as a form of social objection.
Something threatening, disorganized, something that needs to be cast outside the boundary of what's acceptable.
And it's important to see the historical context here. The source material points out that these negative moral ideas about fatness, lazy, gluttonous, no self-control, being a burden, they actually came before the explicit health concerns.
Yes, that's a critical point. The concerns over medical health developed secondarily. They became intertwined with these pre-existing biases, and in doing so, gave them a kind of scientific and moral legitimacy.
So the morality was there first, and then the medical rationale was layered on top to justify the social hierarchy that already existed.
Precisely. And to understand how society enforces this today, the source material breaks down the landscape into 3 major dieting subcultures.
And they all exist on what's called a fat-phobic continuum.
Yes, they're all, at their root, powerful mechanisms of collective self-discipline. They're all designed to mitigate that one fundamental social risk, becoming fat and facing social death, objection.
Okay, let's start at the most extreme end, the pursuit of purity. Thinspo and Pro-Ana.
Right. This world is characterized by extreme restriction. The goal is a kind of bodily and even spiritual perfection and purity.
And the language they use it's almost religious.
It's absolutely religious, not medical. Food is explicitly described in terms of safety, low-calorie controlled portions, and fear binge-prone foods.
And if you break the diet,
It induces these intense feelings of shame and guilt. It's treated as a moral failure, not a dietary slip-up. The mental and physical strength it takes to withstand hunger is held up as the ultimate measure of your character.
and the goal isn't just weight loss, it's something more transcendental, the sublime fantasy.
The sublime fantasy. It's the idea that true mastery over hunger means reaching a state of control where being thin and not eating is no longer an effort.
You've overcome the body.
You transcended the needy, hungry body.
Yeah.
The aspiration is perfection, a state where you've risen above the constant, messy work of managing your body so that the real business of life, achieving success and recognition, can finally begin.
The body is seen as an obstacle to freedom.
A limitation to be overcome. And it's important to note who this cultural ideal is often mapped onto. The source notes that these online communities are overwhelmingly made up of white, wealthy, cisgender, heterosexual, non-disabled women.
And for that specific group, thinness offers the clearest path to what the source calls the proper American body.
And therefore, a valid social subjectivity. Thinness promises the material rewards, the recognition, the acceptance that society grants to those who successfully practice that kind of bodily restraint.
But the ideal spreads beyond that group.
Oh, it's a vast ideal. You see marginalized groups adopting similar patterns. The course mentions Black girl thinspiration, where the goal is often described as working to demark their racialized bodies to achieve greater personhood by striving for a cultural norm that has been historically linked to whiteness and high social status. It just shows how deeply the normative ideal gets internalized across all social hierarchies.
Okay, so if thinspo is about transcendence and purity, let's talk about fitspo. Has that same moralizing language, but the strategy is totally different.
It's less spiritual, much more about long-term physical dominance.
Right. Fitspo is focused on this relentless long-term dominance of the body through intense, sometimes extreme exercise and very meticulous clean eating. The body is a project that is never finished.
It's always to be improved project. And the vocabulary reflects that. It's all about achieving peak health, wellness, and showing respect for yourself through visible, ongoing hard work. A sculpted, low body fat physique is the evidence of that superior commitment.
Honestly, the moment I read about this, my first thought was, that just sounds exhausting.
It is.
If Thinspo is about repression that leads to a fantasy of being free from the body, Fitspo sounds like a commitment to a lifetime of hard labor on the body.
That is the critical insight. Fitspo commits the individual to this ongoing, alienated, narcissistic, and repressive relationship with their own body. Thinspo hopes to transcend the body entirely, but Fitspo accepts that the work is lifelong.
The body is a machine.
A machine that needs constant maintenance and upgrading. And if you stop the effort, it will instantly revert to an unacceptable state. That threat of objection, of becoming fat, is the existential engine driving it all. It's the fear that if you stop working, you lose your social value.
Which brings us to the third category, which is maybe the most insidious just because it's everywhere. Wellness culture.
The mainstream negotiation strategy. It's often presented as the sustainable, progressive, moderate alternative to those other extremes.
And it avoids that harsh, good food, bad food language.
It does. It replaces it with softer, but still equally judgmental terms. Things are nourishing or good for you.
Yeah.
It emphasizes responsibility and sustainability. The whole strategy is about negotiation and incorporating the sustainable management of your body into a holistic lifestyle.
It's about balancing indulgence with moderation.
Yes. It's the responsible, moderate, politically correct citizen's model of body management.
And that's where its power comes from.
It's tremendous social power. Wellness culture is brilliant because it successfully evades what the source calls the social trap.
Meaning?
Well, people in the Thinspo or extreme Fitspo worlds risk being labeled as having a disorder, an eating disorder, or an exercise addiction, which has its own kind of social stigma.
Its own form of objection.
Exactly. But wellness frames the same pursuit of a slim, healthy body as just being a responsible citizen. You're not obsessive, you're just making sustainable choices for your long-term health. And that gives it incredible social legitimacy.
So let's clearly define this concept of objection, because it's the punishment that looms over all of this. Why does our society attach such fierce moral judgment to fatness?
Abjection in a sociological sense is about casting something out as a social threat. Something seen as disgusting or beyond the social boundary that has to be purified or removed.
And in the US, fatness is seen as a form of social deviance.
Fundamentally, it's conceptually linked to all those other traits we mentioned. No self-control, gluttony, immorality. It's a strong deviation from the norm.
The proper American body, slim, white, financially secure. That's the respectable, restrained ideal. Fatness is the opposite of that.
Which is why fatness is seen as threatening the entire normative body hierarchy. And this explains the intense moralizing reaction you often see directed at what's called fat happiness.
When a fat person is unapologetically enjoying themselves or their food in public.
Right. It's like society is saying you are failing to adhere to the social contract of restraint, and worse, you're showing happiness in your failure, which threatens the whole system for the rest of us.
The system that promises us rewards for our own restraint.
Precisely. The disgust and the moral panic are there to maintain the boundaries between the abject body and the socially valid body. A fat person who insists on their own valid subjectivity is contesting that entire complex social system.
So to synthesize this whole section, Thinspo, Fitspo, and especially wellness, they all end up reinforcing fat phobia, just with different strategies.
They do. Wellness is just the most effective because it rationalizes and legitimizes it. It couches that same body normativity in these invisible, acceptable terms like responsibility and moderation. It's the powerful, normalized engine of body hierarchy maintenance, and it uses compliance to gain social approval.
And this incredibly effective cultural enforcement of compliance, it really sets the stage perfectly for the final and most powerful mechanism of control we need to talk about.
We transition now from the individual self-discipline, how we police our own diets, to the state's imposition of discipline, which is more and more being disguised as health.
And this introduces this really profound concept of the therapeutic state. The source material defines this as a kind of fourth ideology of legitimation, right alongside theocracy, democracy, and socialism.
Right. It's a state where medical symbols, medical language, and medical diagnoses replace traditional political or patriotic symbols. A state where medical discretion starts to replace the rule of law.
To understand that threat, where do we begin?
We have to begin with the fundamental reality of what a state is. At its core, the state is an apparatus of coercion. It has a monopoly on violence. And the historical rule is very simple. As the state's influence expands into private life, personal liberties contract.
And the key mechanism the therapeutic state uses is blurring a critical distinction.
The distinction between public health and private health.
Okay, let's spend a minute really defining that boundary, because it seems like its erosion is the foundation for this whole ideology.
It is. Public health, in its historical narrow definition, is about controlling communicable diseases to keep society healthy.
Things that spread from person to person.
Exactly. And this can legitimately require coercion. Things like mandatory quarantines or condemning a contaminated water supply or requiring certain basic vaccinations to protect the community from an outbreak. The coercion is justified because your action directly threatens the health of others.
Okay, so that's public health. What about private health?
Private health requires liberty and individual responsibility. It's about your choices, what you eat, whether you exercise, whether you use a safety device like a seatbelt or a helmet. These decisions primarily affect you, the individual, not the whole community.
But the therapeutic state, it intentionally blurs that line. It uses the authority of medicine and the moral panic around unhealthiness to justify state coercion for purely private choices.
Arguing that the state has to step in to protect people from themselves.
Right.
The classic example to illustrate this is the legal debate over motorcycle helmet laws. When courts argue about these laws, the entire issue boils down to one question. Is the individual rider a private person?
Who has no legal or moral duty to the community to stay healthy?
Or is that rider public property? Someone who does have an obligation to the state to stay healthy, because if they get injured, it will cost the public money or manpower.
And as soon as the state starts providing or mandating more services, especially medical care, the balance shifts. The individual starts to look more and more like public property.
And your liberty on that front erodes. This intrusion by the state is often justified using war metaphors, but the function of the metaphor has completely changed.
How so?
Well, previously, the war and disease metaphor was about doctors helping patients fight an external threat. Microbes are attacking, doctors are fighting the disease. It was benevolent and empowering for the patient.
But now, when the state fights a war on drugs or a war on cancer, the target isn't some external microbe anymore.
The target is the citizen's own choices. The metaphor is now used to justify the state acting like an aggressive doctor, using medical staff as soldiers to protect people from themselves.
To prevent citizens from doing what they actually want to do.
Whether that's smoking or riding a motorcycle without a helmet or using certain substances, it completely transforms the idea of medical aid into a form of moral enforcement.
This is what's called coercive paternalism. The idea that the state has a duty to protect you from yourself based on the assumption that you lack the necessary willpower.
And the argument from people who support this view is that, if a man wants to stop smoking, but he just can't, he lacks the willpower, then coercion is actually helping him.
You're helping him achieve his own long-term rational goals by overriding his short-term irrational impulses.
That's the argument. But the source material pushes back on this very strongly, saying it's a fundamentally flawed idea.
Why?
Well, for one, coercion aimed at protecting people from themselves is incredibly hard to enforce. It often leads to massive abuses in black markets.
Yeah.
But more fundamentally, it ignores a simple fact. The only way to truly know if a man wants to stop smoking more than he wants to enjoy smoking is to see what he does.
To observe his choice.
If he stops, he wanted to stop more. If he continues, he wanted to continue more. The moment the state intervenes with force, you eliminate the very possibility of personal responsibility and true voluntary choice. The state puts itself in the superior position of knowing your true inner desires better than you do yourself.
So let's look at how this pharmacracy, this system of bureaucratic healthcare regulations enforcing control, actually works in practice. First, how does the state get to decide what even counts as a disease that justifies its intervention?
In the therapeutic state, a disease is essentially defined by its treatability. And treatment is just a benevolent word for coercion.
So the pharmacrats, the health bureaucrats, they discover diseases where there used to just be behaviors that the authorities wanted to change or punish.
Exactly. Drug use is a perfect example. It gets redefined as a brain disease that can be forcibly treated through mandatory programs, rather than a voluntary behavior that might have social or legal consequences.
And rebranding behavior as a disease gives the legal system a whole new tool, one that can bypass traditional protections like due process.
Absolutely. Judges are now practicing what they call therapeutic jurisprudence. They're using the court system not just for justice, but as a way to facilitate a healing process. This allows them to coerce nonviolent drug offenders into treatment programs, arguing it's a more humane medical response than punishment.
But the implications for individual liberty are just enormous.
They are. The source cites an example where courts began using their coercive powers to push nonviolent offenders into treatment. But here's the alarming part. Court spokesman indicated that even if a defendant chose to go to trial and was found not guilty of the crime,
Not guilty.
the treatment could potentially still be continued because the health need, the disease, was still there. The system completely distorts the concept of guilt and innocence. The medical imperative trumps the legal one.
That feels like the ultimate conformity mechanism. The state uses the authority of medicine to enforce compliance, and if you refuse the treatment or you refuse to even accept that your behavior is a disease,
Then you're deemed irrational or non-compliant, not simply independent.
and this system needs a new kind of citizen to work properly.
It needs a new model of conformity. The ideal citizen is no longer just passively compliant, but an active informant. The state encourages this responsible citizen model that involves judging, condemning, and reporting on the health problems of others.
I think the source mentioned an example from the Surgeon General.
Yes, a proposal to train hairdressers, clergy, coaches, and teachers to be informants, to recognize the signs of suicide risk in their communities and intervene.
So the medicalization of all of life turns our personal relationships into a kind of vast surveillance network.
All in the name of prevention and health. And it pushes people to conform to this ever-narrowing band of what's considered acceptable or healthy behavior. The passion to judge others masquerades as helping.
Which leads to the ultimate ideological end goal, health über alles, health above all else.
Yes, the attempt to elevate health into a moral value that trumps every other value, especially liberty. And it's based on this profoundly false premise that if a behavior like firearm injuries or tobacco use is a leading cause of death, then it is automatically a public health problem that justifies massive infringements on personal freedom.
This connects all the way back to the EV driver at the dinner party. He was operating under his own form of health über alles, a kind of secular morality where his choice was seen as universally good.
And the details of the supply chain, the complexities, they were irrelevant because they challenged the moral goodness of the symbol.
Right. When you make health, or in his case, perceived environmental purity, a sacred value, all other values like logic or context or liberty, they just fall away.
And the most important insight from the source material about this shift is the historical parallel it draws to show the ideological consequence of getting rid of that private-public health distinction.
And we should be very clear here. We are impartially reporting on the content of the sources, which draw a very strong historical parallel.
Yes, the underlying philosophy abolishing the boundary between private and public health was actually central to Nazi ideology.
The slogans from that era were things like, your body belongs to the nation, your body belongs to the Führer.
You have the duty to be healthy. Food is not a private matter.
That is the ultimate terrifying convergence of all the themes we've discussed. The political state enforcing the individual's compliance with a normative bodily discipline and a moralized vision of health.
The Nazi health ideology, which was wrapped in nationalism and this kind of medical puritanism, explicitly rejected the liberal Western idea of private health. The Reich health leader, Leonardo Conti, said that no one had the right to view health as a personal, private matter. Therapy had to be administered in the interests of the race and society, not the individual patient.
So when health is defined as this sacred, secular holiness that trumps liberty, the ground completely shifts under our feet. The therapeutic state is built on the premise that the individual is incompetent to protect themselves.
And that they need the paternalistic state to enforce their own well-being. This explains why we see this relentless expansion of medical intervention into all human problems. Normal parts of the human condition get redefined as pathologies.
Thinking about death becomes suicidal ideation.
Witnessing something traumatic becomes PTSD that requires a state-mandated intervention. Because death is an integral part of life, medicalizing it creates an endless supply of patients who need state-sponsored help.
The analysis in the source suggests that the therapeutic state ends up swallowing everything human on the seemingly rational ground that nothing falls outside the province of health and medicine.
Just as the theological state had swallowed up everything human on the ground that nothing falls outside the province of God and religion, the ideology of total health control replaces the ideology of total religious control. And the result is that the conformity mechanisms we've talked about,
Starting with psychological pressure to agree on the size of a line,
moving to cultural pressure to have a certain kind of body.
and culminating in political pressure to submit to medicalized state control.
They're all working toward the same goal: eliminating dissent and establishing a totalizing consensus.
So we've really traced the entire arc today. We went from that subtle psychological pressure to conform, in the face of ambiguity or just the fear of being rejected,
Right.
through the cultural enforcement mechanisms that moralize our bodies and discipline us toward a state-approved ideal of what a worthy person looks like.
All the way up to the political system, where medical power is used to justify coercive control over our most private choices.
And the common thread from my dinner table to the doctor's office is that immediate risk of social sanction if you challenge the consensus.
Absolutely. Whether you're the maverick in the Asch experiment, or the fat person demanding joy in a fat-phobic culture, or the citizen who refuses the state-mandated healthy behavior, challenging that consensus risks immediate negative consequences.
That illusion of consensus, whether it's based on lines on a chart or a body type or a medical diagnosis, is what we have to be vigilant against.
In the end, the individual is just relentlessly pushed by their own psychology, by their culture, and by their state to change their perceptions, their opinions, or their behaviors just to maintain a sense of security and belonging.
But this pervasive security, this adherence to the moral statement of the crowd, always comes at the high cost of personal responsibility and liberty.